Democracy is an answer to a question that is different from the liberal question. Remember, the liberal question is concerned with the proper range or extent of governmental authority. Democracy is an answer to the following question. The question is this: whatever the political order, limited, unlimited, whatever, who gets to participate in the political process? Who gets to help determine the laws and policy under which they live? Who gets to actually run for office and hold office? Who gets to participate? Who shall rule is sometimes the way the question is posed. Well, the ancient Greeks were the first to explore this question, and they gave the West three possible answers. They said there are three possible answers to this question of who gets to participate in the political process. You can have a society, they said, where only one person is entitled to rule, to make the laws and to enforce the laws and so forth. A regime in which only one person is entitled to participate, they called a monarchy. Monoarchy. Mono from the word one means the one. Archy from the root of the Greek word to rule. So the rule of one, the Greeks said, is a monarchy. Another possibility is that only a small group of people from within the society are permitted to rule. Not everyone, but a certain select few. And that kind of regime the Greeks called an aristocracy, the rule of the aristos. Aristos, which is the Greek word for best. So only the best people are entitled to rule. Best, however defined, the wealthiest, the most noble, the most virtuous, the most intelligent, or however you want to define it. But not everyone gets to participate, only a small select group. That's an aristocracy, said the Greeks. The third and final possibility is what they called a democracy. The word democracy comes from within the Athenian polis, within the Greek world. The voting districts were divided up into what they called demes, D-E-M-E-S. And the people who lived in the demes were called the demos. And the word democracy comes from that root. A democracy is one in which the demos, the people at large, get to participate in the determination of law and policy. And they get to hold office and run for office. So that's a democracy. So we have one ruling, a few ruling, or the many, the people at large. So democracy is an answer to the question of who gets to participate in the political process. That's a different question from what is the range or extent of governmental power. That's the liberal question, the liberal dimension, and the democratic dimension talks about who gets to, quite simply put, who gets to vote, who gets to hold office, who gets to help determine the law and policy under which they live. Now, democracy itself has many different qualifications and dimensions. You can have what's called a pure democracy, which is what they had in ancient Athens. And a pure democracy is one, it would be, for example, let's say the government proposes a bill of some kind, proposes a law. And what would happen in a pure democracy is they would put that bill out to every single American citizen or every voter and ask them to vote on that bill, yes or no. And whatever the majority wants, 51%, would automatically prevail. It would turn that bill into a law if the majority said yes, and it would reject it if the majority said no. So a pure democracy is straightforward majority rule, where everybody votes directly on the proposed bill, and the majority prevails. Now this, according to the American framers, was the very worst kind of government you could ever imagine. James Madison said, a pure democracy is everywhere a scene of viciousness and injustice. It is vile. Now why would that be? Well, we'll get into that in a moment, because the main reason being that in a pure democracy, there's absolutely no protection whatsoever for the protection of the rights of the individual or of the minority, who must always submit to the will of the majority. And tyranny can come not just from a monarch, but also from the majority. And so they were, as we'll see, the framers were utterly concerned with protecting the rights of each and every individual. And pure democracy necessarily leads to the violation of such rights, so they rejected it outright. And so instead, what they established with our Constitution is not a pure democracy. Pure democracy is sometimes called a direct democracy. That was rejected totally by the framers. Instead, they established what's called an indirect or representative democracy. Now, I'm not sure how many of you have actually voted, but when we vote in the United States, except in a few exceptions with state governments and referenda and so forth, when we go to vote, we're not voting directly on a particular proposed bill, whether or not it should be passed into law. Instead, we vote for our representatives, the people who are supposed to represent the opinions and interests of their constituents. We vote for representatives, obviously, in both federal and state elections. We vote for people to go to the federal government in Washington, the House of Representatives. We vote for the senators who are in the U.S. Congress in Washington. But as we've seen, we also vote for our state representatives in our state legislatures, people who are in the Florida House of Representatives or the Florida Senate, who are supposed to make laws that apply only to the people of Florida. But in all cases, this is a representative democracy. The representatives then are supposed to deliberate, discuss, and then they themselves vote on the proposed measure, whether to vote for it or not. So we have an indirect way of establishing our laws. We do it through our representatives, and it's through our representatives, in theory, that we give our consent to the laws under which we live, the laws and policy under which we live. That's an indirect or representative democracy, and that is what is established by the U.S. Constitution. Now, what's the relationship between these two distinct elements, the liberal dimension and the democratic dimension of the American political order? The relationship, as the framers conceived it, is one of means to ends. The end, or the goal, of our constitutional structure is putting limits on governmental power in the interest of protecting the rights of the individual. Democracy was conceived as one of the means by which we can better achieve that goal. Now, how so? Well, the idea was, certainly the framers who had just left a war with England, the Revolutionary War, and people were all fired up for the protection of their rights, they believed that allowing the people to actually select their representatives and to help establish the law under which they lived would mean that the people would better safeguard their rights by voting for people who would secure their rights and rejecting people who would not. That is one essential purpose of democracy. Second purpose is it's by democracy that we hold the government and the government officials accountable. If they should violate the trust we put in them and begin to tyrannize against the people or to violate their rights, we hold them accountable by threatening to vote them out of office. In the case of the House of Representatives, they have to run for re-election every 2 years, the senators every 6 years, but they know they're on a leash. They can't do whatever they want because they have to face the wrath of the voters coming up soon in the case of the House and a little bit longer in the case of the Senate. But that's the means that we use to hold government accountable, because how else can we hold them accountable if we don't have free and fair democratic elections? And that's a problem. And you'll see that there are many problems with democracy, and we could spend a whole lot of time talking about them. But in the end, we absolutely must preserve a truly democratic elements in our constitutional order. It's not optional for us. And why? Because think about what it was like before we had democratic elections. For most of Western history, for centuries and centuries leading up to the 18th century, how were most people governed? What was the dominant political order? It certainly wasn't democracy. Modern democracy doesn't really emerge until the French Revolution of the 18th century. For centuries leading up to then, the dominant form in the West was obviously a hereditary monarchy. They had kings, and the kings, for the most part, inherited their position from their forebears. It was passed down generation to generation, the kingship. So you had hereditary monarchs who ruled. That's what was ruling during the American Revolution when the colonists rebelled against King George. He was a hereditary monarch. And the problem that arises in hereditary monarchies is this. What do you do if the king stops being a king and starts becoming a tyrant? We go back to the early Greeks. Remember, the Greeks said there are 3 possible regimes: monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy. Those are the good forms of government, said the Greeks. They're good if and so long as they serve justice and the common good. A king who serves justice and the common good is a good king. But what if the king stops doing that and starts to act unjustly and is not concerned with the common good but his own interest or the interest of his friends, what then? Well, the ancient tradition said, in such a case, the king unkings himself and becomes a tyrant. Tyranny is the corrupt form of monarchy. Well, what if an aristocracy stops? An aristocracy is a good form if the members of government actually pursue justice in the common good. But what if they don't? Well, then the aristocracy degenerates into what they call an oligarchy. Sadly, we do have oligarchic elements in our own political order today. That's when a few people use the government to further injustice and their own good rather than the common good of the people. And the third possibility we saw is democracy. A democracy is good if the majority of people pursue justice and the common good. But what if they don't? What if they start acting unjustly and acting in their own interest or the interest of certain select groups? Well, the democracy then degenerates into what we would call mob rule, just simply whatever the majority wants goes, without rhyme or reason or without justice. So back to our question of why do we need democracy? Because prior to having democratic elections, we had monarchs. Now, what do we do if a king becomes a tyrant, starts to pursue injustice and not the common good? How do you get rid of him? What options are open to the people? To live under oppression? Well, if they're not willing to do that, they only have two other options, both of which have been discussed throughout the course of our political development. Back in the Middle Ages, many of the Christian philosophers addressed this question quite directly. What do they do if the king becomes a tyrant? Because they were living under monarchies. This obviously was a concern for them. And the conclusion reached by many distinguished Christian philosophers, including St. Thomas Aquinas, perhaps the most famous of all the Christian theologians, they said, well, under certain circumstances, the best course of action might be what they called tyrannicide, kill the tyrant. That might be the best thing for the common good of the society. Now, you have to weigh these things very carefully and only take such drastic action under extraordinary circumstances, but they conceived that this was a possibility that tyrannicide would be the best course of action. The American revolutionaries in the 18th century took a different approach. They believed that King George had unkinged himself and become a tyrant. Now, what are they going to do about it? Well, they took the only other possible route. They didn't try to kill King George. They didn't engage in tyrannicide, but they had an armed resistance, an armed revolution against the king. So that's the only other option available to people who are living under unjust monarchs. They either kill them, tyrannicide, or have a violent revolution. Well, neither of those is a good option. We don't want violence. So what do we do? So that's why we have democracy. Because democracy, if the rulers become unjust and tyrannical, we don't have to kill them or have a violent revolution. We can vote them out of office. And this is a blessing of democracy that we cannot underestimate. Democracy, it has been said, is the only method that we have yet discovered for the peaceful transition of political power. And that's why we must do everything in our power to be sure that our democratic elections are free and fair. Because if not, the whole system collapses. And the only other method for freeing oneself from oppression and injustice is violence, and we don't want that. In fact, if you look at societies around the world where people have risen up under oppressive governments, it's usually there's a military coup or some sort of violent revolution and so forth. I mean, this is not what we want. So for all the problems with democracy, and there are many, we must preserve it and must carefully secure that we have free and fair elections, because there is no other means yet discovered for the peaceful transition of power. And that's why we have democratic elements in our constitutional order. Now, what precisely are those democratic elements in our Constitution? You constantly hear people screaming, our democracy's in peril, democracy, democracy, democracy. Well, people need to think carefully about what that means. Democracy, the framers were very skeptical of democracy. As a matter of fact, They didn't like it. They did not like the idea that majorities of people could pass whatever laws they wanted and violate the rights of individuals and minorities. They were very skeptical of democracy, but as we see, they put democratic elements in our Constitution because it's the only way we have for the peaceful transition of power and to hold government accountable. So they had to put it in there, but they limited the democratic elements severely. The only authentically democratic element in our original Constitution is the House of Representatives in Washington, D.C. The members of the House are, in fact, elected by Democratic majorities within their districts, within the states. But that's it. The Senate, today we do vote for the two senators from our states democratically. The people in Florida, the majority of them vote, whatever the majority decide, they become the two senators from Florida who go up to the U.S. Congress. But that's a recent innovation. That was due to an amendment passed in the early 20th century. The original Constitution, how the framers wanted the senators selected, was people did not directly vote for them as they do today. Instead, the state legislatures of each of the respective states selected the senators who would be in the U.S. Senate in Washington. So it was an indirect election by the people. The people would elect their state representatives up there in Tallahassee or whatever your home state is, and then the state legislatures would choose the two senators who were to represent Florida, for example, in the U.S. Senate. So they had an indirect method of election. Again, not direct democracy. The President of the United States is not elected by strictly democratic process. If that were the case, all we would do is everybody in the country would vote yes or no for the presidential candidate. We count up all the votes, and whoever got the most wins. That's called a popular election. We don't have that in our Constitution. Instead, we have a very complex process whereby the president is elected by means of the Electoral College. And I just want to be sure you understand how that works, the Electoral College. We have something called electors in the various states. And these are the people who vote for the presidential candidate. Well, how are electors determined? The way it works by law is that every state gets given a certain number of electors who are able to vote for the president. And the number they get is determined in part by the population of that state. What they do is they take the total number of representatives in the U.S. House of Representatives in Washington, and by law, since the 20th century, that number is capped at 435. As our country grew, as our population grew, they had to limit the number of people in the House, otherwise there'd be like 5,000 people trying to legislate, which obviously would just lead to chaos. So the maximum that can be in the U.S. House of Representatives is 435. Plus, you add on to that the 100 senators that are in the U.S. Senate. Obviously, 2 senators from each state, that equals 100 total senators. So you add up these two numbers, 435 plus 100 is 535, plus 3 electors are given to the District of Columbia, Washington, D.C., the idea being that they live under such a heavy presence of the federal government that they should have some say in deciding who the president is. So Washington, D.C. gets 3 electoral votes. So you add them up, 435 plus 100, 535 plus 3 is 538. There's a total of 538 electoral votes that are at stake. And the president is the person who manages to get a majority of that 538 votes, and that is 270. So the presidential candidates, they have to figure out a strategy to gain 270 votes. Now, why did the framers make this so complicated? Now, how do you get to 270? Well, obviously, you do have to win many of the very big states with big populations, California, New York, Illinois. You know, they have massive cities and huge populations. But even if you got all the big cities, you're not going to get up to 270. In order to reach that, you have to win certain of the smaller states, the states who normally would not have much say in things because the population is very small. You know, Connecticut, Rhode Island, North Dakota, and so forth, right, out in the hinterlands with very small populations. But if you want to be president, you do, in fact, have to get some of those votes from these smaller states. Now, why would the framers make this so complicated? And again, it demonstrates their intense concern with protecting the rights of individuals and minorities. Because if you didn't have that, if you only had a straightforward popular vote where the biggest states and biggest cities win every single time, there would be no representation in the US government for people who live in less populated places. Universally, we'd have the president would be chosen by the people who live in California, Chicago, New York, and nobody else would ever have a chance. And that would be oppressive, because the people in those large cities, by and large, have very different views from people who may live in smaller rural communities and so forth. And the framers wanted to be sure that all of Americans, everyone, was represented in the federal government, and not just those numerically powerful groups. And that's why they set up the Electoral College, to be sure that presidential candidates have to attempt to appeal to the interests and values of everyone, and not just those people in the larger states. So liberalism and democracy, they work together. Hopefully, the democratic element will enable us to hold the government accountable, to enable people to better protect their rights by voting those who would violate them out of office, and the goal being a limited government that is limited to the protection of the rights of each and every individual. That's what liberal democracy means, and it has been the dominant form in the modern world, under attack everywhere. There's no question. Most of the Western democracies in Europe and in the United States, Canada, the liberal democracies are under challenge right now, as I'm sure many of you know, and those of you who read the news. But this has been, it still is the gold standard for what people who value freedom strive for. To have a liberal democracy where government is inherently limited, not able to do anything at once, and to have the rulers chosen by the people and accountable to the people. And that is our political order. In case, all right, well, we'll stop here now. Next, we're going to come back and show another dimension of our kind of order, and that is this issue of the public and private sectors. So we'll take a little break, and then we'll be right back. Thank you.